Hello and welcome to the AFP webinar, Building a Winning Team, Recruiting, Retiring, and Refining Nonprofit Boards. It is my pleasure to introduce our speaker for today, Tom Nisbet. Tom is the owner and CEO of the Nisbet Group, TNG. TNG services include campaign consulting, strategic planning, and board governance training for nonprofit organizations. Tom has served as a university VP, business school dean, and professor of economics. He is serving as the 2012 AFP Arkansas chapter president. You can also find Tom's mountain life lessons on his blog, aspirationpaths.wordpress.com. And with that, Tom, the floor is all yours.
Hey, big thanks, Jessica. I want to thank Peach New Media and AFP, in particular Rhonda, for making this opportunity available to me. I appreciate it. Thank you, everybody who's listening in today. Looks like we have about 46 attendees. And here's the starting point today. While it's important for us to build a staff team, it's important to build a team of dependable volunteers, the most important team to build is your nonprofit board. And so we're going to be talking about building a winning team, recruiting, retiring, and retraining or retaining nonprofit boards. Our first poll question that you have there identifies who's in the audience. I hope that you will reply there to one of these four categories. Click that if you're an executive director in the room today. Click board member if you're a board member. If your title is development director, click that. If you're other nonprofit staff like marketing or events coordinator, plan giving, you can click other nonprofit staff. I know that there are groups out there, and some of you may just have to reach a consensus and say, well, most of us in the room are executive directors or most of us are development directors. We appreciate those that meet at a site and those groups that are joining us today. So it looks like we're at about 20% executive director, 14% board member, 23% development directors, and 41% other nonprofit staff. That's a great sample and a great representation. I hope that you will encourage your board members to attend some of the webinars with you and in the future take them to trainings and webinars. We're going to talk a little bit more about that today. Our objectives for the day are what I call our webinar itinerary. Include these bulleted items that you can see on the screen now. We want to learn the three secrets of getting where we're going. We want to consider what I call the 5 R's of better boards or best practices. Those include things like raising expectations for board members, practicing board identification and recruitment, defining that process, practicing how to retire the wrong board members. We're going to talk a little bit more about that today. Developing and motivating or refining your board members and the methods for doing that, and then requiring accountability and board evaluation. A second polling question I'd like for you to respond to as we're getting started here is, what kind of board do you represent? Do you represent a governing board? Its primary purpose is governing or operating. Are you from a foundation board whose primary purpose would be fundraising? Maybe serve on an advisory board, or you have an advisory board, or you have a board of reference, which is just typically a list of people who lend their names to the organization. We've got a larger percentage of boards that are foundation boards. Usually, those are primarily formed for the fundraising function, and so that's their primary purpose. But pretty good mix between foundation boards and governing boards. Thank you. That helps me see who is in the room and what kind of boards that you have. I wanted to share this quote with you. It has been said that nonprofit boards seem to have one thing in common. They do not function well, or when they do function, it's well below their potential. I include this quote because I want to encourage you to buy this little paperback. It's called Nailing Down a Board. You can go on Amazon, get these small little paperback for $5. I give them to all of my board members. The subtitle is Serving Effectively on the Not-for-Profit Board. It tells board members and prospective board members, here's what boards do and here's what they don't do. So I recommend that book to you so that we can help each of our nonprofit boards be a winning team. I woke up in my North Face tent about 2 summers ago in the Wind River Range in Wyoming. We had just climbed the highest mountain in Wyoming. It's called Gannett Peak, and it was our 49th state high point. We've gone on to climb the highest mountain in all 50 states, and it was 3 in the morning. It was a little cold outside. I didn't really want to get up. I was just lying there awake in my sleeping bag, and it just struck me that there are 3 secrets to getting where you're going, whether you're climbing mountains or whether you're building a better board of directors. The first secret is to tell me where you're going. Most of us view that as the written plan, or in nonprofit sector we call it the strategic plan. Whatever you want to call it, a business plan or a strategy, it's your written plans of where you want to go. If you don't have a written plan, it's going to be difficult to get where you want to go. I'm going to skip the second one and go down to the third one. The third secret is to tell what resources you really need. That's the whole budgeting process, the development plan. We're not only identifying what's in the budget, what revenue exists, but what amount of money we're going to have to raise beyond our revenue in order to meet our nonprofit budget. And that's a process where you need to have both a budget and a development plan. But the secret I wanted to talk about today is the second one. Tell me who's going with you. Those are the people that are on your team. In climbing great mountains, we are careful to select people that are going to be on the rope with us, that are going to need dependable mountaineering skills. And for nonprofits, you're building a board of people that are going with you. They're surrounding you. They're going in the same direction. They have a passion for your organization and cause. And without identifying the kinds of people and the categories of people that you need to have on your team, it'll be difficult to get where you're going. When you tell me where you're going, and in particular who's going with you, this is the language we normally use in the nonprofit sector. Well, what is the appropriate board size, and who should the board be composed of? What categories of people or kinds of people? And how do we encourage board participation? I'm going to let you explore those 3 things on your own. It's kind of homework, I guess. But part of answering the question of who's going with you is to answer those questions of what's the right size for us, what's the right composition for our board, and how do we get boards that are more participative. Jessica, I think that might not be a bad place to stop and just ask if anybody has a question about board size, board composition, or board participation.
Thank you very much, Tom. And if you do have a question, you can just click on the Q&A button in the upper left-hand corner of the webinar window, type in your question, and then click Ask to submit it. We'll give everyone a moment here. It doesn't appear we have any questions at this time, but please feel free to submit them at any time throughout the webinar.
Thank you, Jessica. Now, the third polling question is available for you there, and I'd like to know whether yours is a foundation board or a governing board or any kind of board, what size of boards do most of you have? If you'll just answer that. I'm working with a client right now that has a 6-member board. I know of another organization that has a 3-member board. I prefer a 12 to 18-member board probably in most of the boards I've served on or the boards I work with. Sometimes a larger board is important if you're going into a capital campaign or you're just trying to increase your influence in the community, sometimes you have a large board. Looks like we have 57%, 55 in the 12 to 18 members, so that's a pretty typical size. I'm glad that's your answer. That's a number I like to work with. 20% of you have 20 to 28 members in your board size, so we're pretty close in size. None of you seem to have a very large board like sometimes hospitals and universities have the 40-member board. 55% or so have 12 to 18. Thank you for that. One of the things for you to know is that you can change your board size. Your organization has bylaws. I know our AFP bylaws say that our board must have a minimum of 5 or a maximum of 35. That's a pretty large range, but know that you have control over that. You might need to expand your board if it's too small or if you're going into a campaign. By the same token, you may have been living with a cumbersome board of 25 or 30 and you don't get good attendance and participation, and you might want to reduce the size of your board. So know that you have control over the size of your board. Now I want us to talk about what I call the 5 R's of better boards. Hopefully this is a good memory device for you, and it kind of helps you remember these best practices of great nonprofit boards. The first R is to raise expectations of board members. We want constantly to be asking them to tell us what should we expect of a great board member. You can give them a list of written expectations. We expect you to attend every meeting. We expect you to be on a committee. We expect you to give to the organization. And sometimes that's the way members are recruited. You already have some written expectations. If you don't have them, I encourage you to write some down. I primarily want to encourage you to make that a 30-minute board agenda item at one of your board meetings and go around the table with your board and ask them, what is it realistic that we would expect of one another, that we would expect of a board member on this board, and let them decide. We're going to talk a little bit more about each of these 5 R's in our presentation today, but I think it's important not only to raise expectations, demand and ask more of them, but to have those in written form, whatever they are. A second R is to recruit the right board members. The right board members is going to vary with the organization. It doesn't mean that some people are better than other people, but you're looking for people with a passion for your organization. We're going to talk about this in a lot of detail together today. It's really about the process that you use to identify, recruit, and train great board members, and I want to talk about that in more depth. A topic that a lot of people ask me about is how do you retire the wrong board members? Again, they may not be bad people. I'm saying they're inactive, they miss a lot of meetings, they are weak, they don't participate particularly, or they're just ineffective. They don't understand the purpose of your organization. And so we're going to define the process for retiring those board members that might be in one of those categories. Just a weak member, maybe a board member that's ineffective or inactive. Many of us, if you've served on boards, as I have, many of us have board members that have just been on the board for many, many years. Sometimes there are term limits, but we put them back on the board or we don't ever take them off. And we have somebody that's been on the board for 20 years and they just served a long time, and we might need to discuss with them what other kinds of ways they would like to participate in the organization. And we're going to talk about retiring board members a little more. Fourth, the fourth R of better boards is to develop and train and motivate your board members by taking retreats. I believe in the annual board retreat. I know, believe me, how difficult it is sometimes to get boards to make that commitment and take a retreat, but whether that's a one-day planning retreat or a weekend retreat or a longer kind of time away, with your board members, that's the appropriate place to develop those boards, to get to know each other better, to train them, whether it's in fundraising skills or governance skills, to motivate them by allowing them to hear some motivational speakers or inspirational speakers talking on the topic of board governance. So we're going to talk about different ways to do that retreat. And then finally, the fifth R is to require that responsibility and accountability be embedded in nonprofit boards. That sounds a little strict, but all I mean is that we be intentional about making sure that we hold people to our expectations, that we hold them to the agreement, and that we work with those board members to help them be better board members. Let's look, before we stop again, at this first one on raising expectations of board members. All of these expectations verbs start with an I, and I did that on purpose so that you would be able maybe to remember some of these. As we recruit board members, talk to potential board members, and together raise our expectations of one another, these are 6 items that I think are very important for boards to have a conversation about. First, the level of interest. We need to develop, or to determine their level of personal interest. You know from many seminars that passion for the organization is a big motivator of donors. We know from many board members they're willing to come on your board and serve on it because they're personally interested in what you're doing. What we want to do here is determine their level of interest and whether this is the right time for a board member to be on our board. There are seasons in life when someone would make an excellent board member, but it's just not the right time in their life. They're caring for an elderly parent, or their work is just too busy. So it's determining their passion for the organization, but it's determining their level of personal interest. Secondly, we raise expectation with a conversation around the investment we want them to make in our board. We want to secure their financial commitment to the board. So many people are recruited to boards, and this is either not explicit or it's not talked about at all. I don't know any nonprofit board that doesn't need every board member to be giving, and so to make that a written board expectation just makes it clear that we need their financial commitment. And as we share our written expectations with prospective board members, we mention that we need for them to be financially committed to the organization. A third way we raise expectation is to talk about their involvement. Emphasize that we want their active involvement. We want them to come around. We want them to come to our events. We want them to be actively involved both as board members and participants in our cause or in our organization. Board members often will say, I don't know how to help, or I don't know what I can do. We want to emphasize that for their term, maybe that's only a 3-year term or a 4-year term, we want their active involvement. We expect them to attend all the meetings, and we expect them to come to our events. It may only be for 3 years or 4 years, not a lifetime, not a forever kind of commitment, but while they serve on the board, we want them active in what we're doing and participating in the board. A fourth way that we raise the expectations of board members is to talk about their influence. Leading and leadership means using their influence, and so as we have conversations with current board members and with prospective board members, we're having this conversation about influence. Who do they know? Who would they be willing to go talk to? They need to be our ambassadors. They need to be our best storytellers. And so we help them identify their circles of influence, their places and people that they can share about our organization with. You've heard the old saying that board members need to be donors, doers, and door openers. Well, when they lead by using their influence, they're a door opener, and they may get an appointment for us with a friend of theirs, or they may be able to get us in for an appointment with someone based on their relationship with that person. So we talk about using their influence. A fifth way we raise expectations of board members is we extend a personal invitation. I'm going to talk more in the recruiting section about doing this in person. I know so many board members who've been recruited over the phone. The conversation goes something like this: Charlie, we've got some empty seats on our board, and your name came up, and we just think you'd be great serving on this board. Or, Mary, we have three openings on our board, and somebody mentioned you, and I'm calling you on the phone to just ask you if you would be willing to serve on the board. Please, please don't recruit your board members that way. Even for national boards like Red Cross or Salvation Army or some of the larger international organizations, extend a personal invitation. You're going to see that as I describe the recruitment process, that it's just very important to do that in person and make it an invitation to come on our board. We're making board service a privilege. When we communicate that way, we're saying it's a privilege to serve on our board. We have a waiting list. People want to be on our board. It's fun. And that's an important perspective to communicate both to current board members, but especially to prospective board members. And finally, we raise expectation by examining integrity a little bit. I know everyone has a different definition of integrity. Some people say it's what you do when no one's watching. Some people just describe it as simple honesty. But with all the scrutiny that we are under in nonprofits today, both by Congress as well as by other governing organizations, we want to raise expectations for our board members that we're looking for people of integrity. Here's the way we do this in most of the great boards I work with. We encourage a personal testimony. A testimony or a statement is better than a title. Here's how this usually happens. We say, oh, we need to recruit Bob to our board. He's VP over at the university. Or we need to recruit Julie because Julie is the manager of personnel, and she would be great on the board. I think when we recruit board members, we ought to be less concerned with their title and more concerned with their testimony. Let me give you a practical example. One of my colleagues was the chairman of the board of a hospice organization. I never heard, I'm going to change her name, but I never heard Mary say, hi, I'm chairman of the board of such and such hospice. She always said, hi, I'm Mary. Hospice served my daddy at the end of his life. They just did a remarkable job of caring for him. It impacted our whole family, and that's why I serve on the hospice board. She always told her story. She always told why it was that she was involved with the organization first. She didn't meet you with her title. Jessica, I think I'll stop right there because I've been talking a lot. Take a drink of water and ask if there's any question about those categories.
We did have a couple questions come in since the last break. This one's about a little earlier topic, but okay. Someone asked, when is a board considered too big?
You know, when you consider it too big, when it's bulky, unmanageable, there are just too many people to build relationships with.
Thank you. Next question. Is it unusual to have as board members people who benefit from the nonprofit organization and the donations received by the organization?
We might have to clarify that question a little bit more, Jessica. My initial reaction is every board and organization should have a conflict of interest policy. And generally when you read those conflict of interest policies, I just read one yesterday, it would prohibit a board member benefiting from some of what comes into the organization. I'm not sure if that's exactly what the questioner is asking.
Thank you. And if that questioner has any additional questions or needs to clarify, please go ahead and submit another question. Another question we have, is there a recommended contribution for board members, example, a hospital fundraising board that raises $1.2 million a year?
You know, that's a great question, and I would like to go back to my general advice is a board ought to have that conversation. Most of us show up at board meetings, we go through the agenda, we make motions, we vote on motions, we approve the budget, and we have an hour-long meeting and we move on. It's very important in the management of a great board to have some agenda items that allow us to converse about important questions like this. So the board ought to say around the table what's reasonable for us to expect of each other. A hospital board might have a $5,000 minimum. I run into some large institutions who sometimes have that size of an annual gift as a minimum expectation. I like it better when the board has had a conversation kind of like this. They go around the table, they talk around an amount, and they finally say, you know, I don't think it's unreasonable for this 18-member board to expect that we each would be giving at about a $100 per month level. That would be $1,200 a year or somewhere in the $1,000 to $1,200 range. I don't think we ought to look over people's shoulder and see what amounts they write their checks for. Most of us just want 100% board participation in giving. But for the board to have that conversation, they'll generally settle on a number that's a good number, and it's a number that they can all buy into.
Thank you very much, and I think we'll just take one more question of this section. Can you please speak to the role of the CEO in board recruitment?
I will, and I think I'll speak to it a little bit more in some of the subsequent slides. I have seen organizations and boards where the CEO played a major role, and you'll see it a little bit later in my slides that I believe that an executive director should spend 1/3 of his or her time in board development. That sounds like a lot of hours every week or every month, but until you have an exceptional board in place, I recommend that executive directors spend 1/4 to 1/3 of their time in board development. Now, the names shouldn't all be generated by the executive director. The very best prospective board names come from current board members. They ought to be constantly prospecting, constantly thinking about others who would like to serve on that board. So brainstorming once a year or twice a year, writing down some of those names that board members recommend is the way the CEO gets the names. But board development is like donor development. It's a relationship business, and until you've spent a pretty good amount of your time every week or every month in developing your board members and your relationship with them, you won't have the kind of board you need until you do spend that much time.
Thank you very much. And we did have a clarification from the person asking the conflict of interest question, so I just wanted before we moved on to the next section. They asked, as a retirement community with a foundation committed to enhancing the lives of the residents with the use of projects funded by the foundation, is it considered a conflict of interest to include residents as board members?
In one example and experience that I've had with that, there are residents on the board. There's also usually a resident council separate from the board, and that resident council may elect one or two people, residents, to be on the governing board. Then the next step just needs to be determined by the board. Are those voting members of the board that come from the resident council, or are they ex officio members of the board?
Thank you very much, and I think that's all the questions we'll take at this time.
Thank you, Jessica. Now, the next slide goes into the personal recruitment of board members, and this begins a process that I think is so important as we build a winning team. It's a two-step process. The first is always trying to prospect and identify potential board members, people that have a passion for the organization. They have the purse, they have some reputation of being a giver or maybe a generous giver, and they're a person of character and competence. This requires constantly looking for people. What we typically do is we typically look out into the community and we look further afield, and sometimes we need to recruit from some of the leaders in the community. It's that old 80-20 rule that those most involved people do 80% of the work. But oftentimes we overlook people that have a passion for our organization. They've been impacted by its work, by its cause, and we need to look at them because they are people who have a circle of influence, and we need to be constantly looking within our own organizations for potential board members. But the second part of this process is the screening criteria. Most of us are just desperate for board members. We've got empty slots and we want to fill them. I would rather have 3 empty seats on the board and wait for a great board member than to just fill those 3 seats with people that haven't been screened and aren't really excited about coming on the board. So I use these kinds of screening criteria as best practices. One, I like to have a board member recommendation. That means the board member knows the nominee. The board member may or may not have had a conversation with them yet, but they know them personally and they can recommend that they do know about our organization. They are passionate about it. They are philanthropic or generous in their giving, and they are honest and competent people. So the first part of the screening criteria is a board member recommendation. I think 90% of your great prospective board members should come from current board members constantly identifying other people who could serve on the board. A second is to have an application process. It might only be 1 page, but have an applicant fill out that application and indicate whatever information you want to put on that. It's like a job application. It can be a 1-page application that just says, we formalize this process a little bit because we're interested in being very intentional about the process and about finding great board members. And then thirdly, as a screening criteria, include a personal statement. Maybe it's like the personal testimony. This is how this organization has touched our family or my life or impacted me. Or here's why I'd really like to serve on your board. That may only be a paragraph, but if you will get a written board member recommendation, a 1-page written application, and a 1-page personal statement, you'll begin to build a stronger board, a winning team. Now, this next slide continues that process. And it's really the second of my R's, recruit the right board members. There are right board members and wrong board members. There are good board members and bad board members. There are strong board members and weak board members. There's generous board members and stingy board members. There's all kinds of board members. This is more about using a process that honors and respects people than it is defining what's right. The Habitat for Humanity Board has different needs for their board than the food bank does. The hospital has different needs on their board. A foundation board has need of different kinds of people. When I say the right board members, I'm really saying that we've done due diligence to screen them in the way I just described, and then to honor them by recruiting them personally. So here are those steps. The board should screen and approve the names of board nominees. When I do this with exceptional boards and boards that are following best practices, they have a written board member recommendation, they have a completed application form, and they have a personal statement of why they would like to come on the board or serve on our board. So the current board screens and approves any nominees to fill any unfilled positions or the class of 2014 or however it is that your board rotation is set up. Secondly, we should contact each nominee individually and in person. As you've already heard me say, I don't want to recruit a board member by email or by telephone or text or any way like that. I want a personal recruitment. It communicates to them that our organization is organized, it's intentional, and it's looking for a few great men or women, and that we want to do that in person. We want to build a relationship, and so we're willing to make that appointment and to do that in person. So that third step is to call that nominee, make an appointment, take a new board member packet, which I'll describe for you a little later, and see them personally. What you're going to do in that appointment is pay them the respect of taking just 10 or 15 minutes of their time, covering the written expectations that your organization has of board members, telling them a little bit more about the organization, sharing some of the information in the board packet, and seeing if this is a good time in their life to come on the board. Just because they've been nominated and just because they look like a good fit, it may not be a good fit for them. It might not be the right time for them to come on the board. So this is a personal recruitment of prospective board members. Sometimes you're only filling 3 spots, and it might be the CEO or the executive director who calls on all 3 of those people. That CEO may do that alone, or they may take another board member with them to do that. Sometimes you're filling 7 or 8 positions, perhaps, and that needs to be divided up, and the board chairman or another board member and the executive director divide those names up and call on the people because it's just too many people for one person to call on. It's still done in person. It's still done with making an appointment and going and sitting down with that prospective board members. I've done this so many times, and I have gone through the process I've just described to you, and someone will look me in the eyes and say, "Tom, that sounds like a great organization, but boy, I just can't do that right now. I appreciate knowing what you expect of board members. I appreciate knowing all about the organization, but it's just not the right time in my life to do that." This may be a person of quality that you'll recruit sometime in the future, so you're leaving that door open. Fourth, you cover all the items in your list of board member expectations, some other items, perhaps if you have time in the board packet. If the nominee cannot agree, suggest that he or she consider serving at another time, that you'd like to kind of keep them on your waiting list, and thank them for their time. This last point is just a reiteration. Personal recruitment is critical to obtaining the right board members. It's just a way to begin to build what will be a professional relationship, much like your donor relationships with major donors. There's no more important volunteer than the board member, and they're often a volunteer, a donor, and all that wrapped into one, and they serve on your governing board. I want to tell you a quick story. You see the note there, Frank's story. Frank was a perfect candidate for one of the boards that I worked with, and he had been screened, and he had been approved, and so I went to see Frank. He lived in another city, and I went to see him, and he just lined right up with with the organization's purposes, with what we could expect for board members. I went over the written expectations. He said, yeah, I think I'd like to serve on that board. I'll be at your January meeting. And so he drove to our city, and he came to that meeting. And in a break, after we'd been doing some board member orientation, Frank pulled me aside and said, Tom, I noticed that you require that people give monthly or annually to your board. And he said, somehow, I know you went over that stuff, but I just missed that. And my wife and I right now just can't give. We give to some other things, but we can't give. We can't fulfill that expectation is what he's saying. And I think I did the right thing. I said, Frank, you line up so much. You'll be a great board member. We hope you'll work our organization into your giving eventually, but we'd like for you to be on the board. You've gone through our process. And he looked me straight in the eye and said, no, you expect your board members to give financially and give regularly, and I'm telling you, I can't do that right now. I'm not going to serve at this time. And Frank went home. The important thing is that we pay people the respect of telling them what we expect of board members. We make it explicit. We make it written. And while this takes more time, it's why I think an executive director can spend a quarter to a third of their time in board development until they kind of reach a tipping point and really kind of reach a place where they have an exceptional board. It takes more time to do it this way, but you'll have a waiting list. You'll have people wanting to serve on your board. In my 30 years of working with boards, serving on boards, I've worked with great boards. I've worked with responsible boards. I've worked with some dysfunctional boards. I've worked with some weak boards. And I've worked with a few boards who were moving from good to great. In all those years, I've only worked with 2 boards that I call exceptional boards. That's a whole nother webinar. But what I would have you know is that those are exceptional organizations, and they're exceptional organizations because they took the time to build an exceptional board. That's my highlighted point for for that point. I want to go ahead and talk about retiring the wrong board members, and then I'll see if there's any questions about this process. The wrong board members are those men and women who can't fulfill those 6 items I listed earlier, those 6 words that began with an I. Retiring is like recruiting. It's kind of the opposite. It's in reverse. But it's best done in person. Make an appointment. Take an active board member with you. If you're the CEO or executive director that is charged with this task, it's good to have a witness. It's good to have a second person with you. Go over the written expectations. Handle that with gentleness and patience, and try to resolve the issue in that meeting. I have had all kinds of reactions as we've used this process, but they've all been positive. Some people look at you with great relief and say, oh, I know I haven't been effective or active, and it's just a time that I probably don't need to be serving on the board. Maybe I can in the future. Another person might say, no, I really love being on this board. I know I've been traveling a lot or been inactive, but I want to stay on the board. I know you've got a rule about not missing more than 3 meetings. I'm going to be active. I'm going to meet the expectations, and I'm going to step up. Thanks so much for coming and reminding me how important this responsibility is. It's really the recruitment process in reverse. You're going to someone who's already a board member, and you're going through the same process of covering what you expect of board members and just asking them if this is the right time for them, or if it's not necessarily the season for them to be serving. There are people, and some of you may have questions that speak to this. There are people who you don't want to lose their contribution and their donation. And I don't mean just their money donation. I mean their involvement, their support. And so I think that you'll know what to do in those situations. I've had people who served on a board for 20 years, and they didn't really want to leave, but they kind of knew that
they weren't as energetic as they used to be, or that some younger people needed to come on the board. And we created a board member emeritus for that person, and they were welcome to attend any meeting. Or we made them a lifetime board member if that was appropriate. There's numerous ways to deal with this, but you, as you have those conversations with a board member who's weak or inactive, you're paying them the honor and respect that I think they deserve. Now, somebody may have a question, Jessica, about that recruitment process or the retirement process.
Thank you very much. We did have a question. We have some board members whose expertise we need, but not who are in a financial position to donate at a high level. We do not have any staff right now. We're still developing and doing capital fundraising. Is there a way to set a expectation of any kind as well as, an expectation of in-kind as well as financial donations?
Oh, absolutely. An in-kind gift is just as valuable as a cash gift. We had board members at the university who worked for the power company, and so they could get us electrical equipment either at a discount or they could give it to us in kind. I think we have to acknowledge both that kind of influence, which is that I word again, both that kind of influence as well as their expertise. I want to tell you a quick story because it just popped in my head. One of our board members at the university couldn't give much money. It didn't mean he didn't give any. We expected every board member to give some, and Bill gave some, but he couldn't give a lot. He was retired, but he knew everybody in the state of Alabama. And he used his influence or his expertise to talk to those people, even brought some of them all the way to Texas from Alabama to look at the university, to look at the campus. And one of those gentlemen in particular, first gift was $1 million gift. Bill and his wife could never give $1 million gift. They probably couldn't give but down in the thousands. Over the years, the man's second gift was $5 million. And after I left the university, and some years later, they were building a new auditorium, performing arts kind of facility, and he gave $15 million toward a $30 million project. We want to acknowledge in-kind contributions, contribution of skill, expertise. It's why we sometimes want certified financial planners on our board, or a CPA on our board, or tax attorneys, other people with expertise that maybe at this point in their life they're still acquiring and they're paying for orthodontics in college and everything for their kids, and they can't give much, but they have influence and they have expertise. One of our board members on one of the exceptional boards I've worked with is a CPA. He always manages to go out and find a firm that will do the audit for free, or at least a financial review for free, because this is a small organization with a small budget. And his expertise in knowing the accounting community in that city and being willing to go out as a board member and find someone to do the annual audit or the annual financial review is invaluable. Saves us $3,000 to $5,000 probably. So, yes, the short answer is yes, we do want to find ways to acknowledge those other kinds of contributions.
Thank you very much. And another question goes back to a little earlier topic. How does one address expected financial contributions for ex officio board members' appointments?
You know, that's a great question. As gently as possible, I believe that the most appealing case for everyone giving, whether they're a voting member of the board or non-voting or staff member or anyone else, is that we need 100% participation. In many cases, we don't tell you the amount. You may give $10, but we can, in all honesty, report to foundations and corporations and individuals that we have 100% board participation. You might have an ex officio member of the board who's inactive that isn't required to be at every meeting,
and maybe you wouldn't count that person necessarily as an active, involved board member, but in all integrity, if they're a member of the board, voting or non-voting, the 100% board participation case is the most appealing case. So even asking that ex officio member to make some contribution, I don't think is an unrealistic expectation.
Thank you. And we have one more question, and at this time, have you seen boards require references from prospective board members? How successful have staff recommendations been for prospective board members?
Yes, I have seen them require references. Sometimes that happens with ministry and mission organizations where they want references of the person. I've even seen background checks. So I guess the short answer to that is yes. And of course, great recommendations come from staff. Oftentimes staff know your major donors, know some of your volunteers, know other people impacted by your organization, and they can give you great names. In fact, you may involve some of those staff people in the recruitment of board members in this process that I've defined.
Thank you very much, and that is all the questions we have at this time.
All right, we'll move on, and I know we're approaching the top of the hour. The fourth R in better boards or best practices is to retreat, to develop, train, and motivate board members. I think they're just essential for building relationships. Actually, some of the exceptional boards I've worked with, people look forward to that board retreat. Sometimes the purpose is a day of strategic thinking together. Sometimes it's fellowship. Sometimes it's golf or shopping. Sometimes it's strategic planning. Sometimes it's training and fundraising. You can include certain staff in that role. But to me, the board retreat, and for most it's an annual retreat. Sometimes it can be done more often than that. But that's the perfect place to do that. Unless you have longer board meetings like universities have, 2- and 3-day board meetings, unless you have the longer board meeting, you need to utilize the annual board retreat to develop, train, and motivate board members. I think the board ought to be involved in planning it. Oftentimes staff will say, we've got the annual board retreat. Please sign up if you're going to come, and we'll plan it all out for you. That's okay, but again, that's depending on staff to do all of that, and staff can provide the support. But I think the board should be involved in planning what they want this year's retreat to look like, where they feel like they need some help in governance or in strategy or in fundraising. A lot of groups use a different retreat setting every year. One of my clients right now goes up on a mountaintop at a lodge, and they use the same beautiful place every year, and that's where the board wants to go. So you kind of have to listen to the board on that. It may need to be close by to your city. It's nice to go to a retreat center or a lodge, something to kind of get out of the city. Prepare an agenda and stay on schedule. You owe them that. Provide board and staff training if that's the function of that retreat. Use a facilitator when that's helpful. I think that's helpful a lot of the time, but I would think so. Allow time for fellowship and networking, and probably save a few hours before or after or during that board retreat to do a new board member orientation. I think you have a lot of freedom with this. What I find is groups just don't do it. They either aren't in the tradition of doing an annual board retreat, or they did it some years ago and they miss years. However you want to format it, plan it, and whatever you want to do to develop, train, and motivate board members is your business. But the fact that you do this every year and have an annual retreat, our AFP board here in Arkansas has 5 board member expectations. As one of them, you will attend the January board retreat. Ours is planned for 18th and 19th. We're going out to a retreat center. The board knows every year in January that we do the annual board retreat and that they're expected to come. It's actually a half-day Friday, an overnight, and a half-day Saturday, and some leisure activities at the lake when it's over. So the fact that you schedule a retreat and do that is the important point here. A fifth R is to require accountability in nonprofit boards. You've probably heard this by reading legislative reviews and seeing what Senator Grassley's doing in Congress and the Sarbanes-Oxley Act a few years ago. You know that we're under increasing scrutiny, so we just want to make sure that we have accountability built into our boards. We have the policies we need, like conflict of interest policies or confidentiality policies and all those things. These 5 responsibilities of a nonprofit board, I'll let you read them. They come right out of that little paperback that I mentioned at the beginning, Nailing Down a Board. So I'll let you go read those 5 responsibilities. They can actually be summarized as only 3 things, which I did in red down below. There's really just 3 major roles of a nonprofit board: governance, strategy, and fundraising. Boards govern, staff manage. You don't want board members involved in the day-to-day management of your organization. They're involved in governance. Governance includes these things like writing and setting policies. It includes things like evaluating the executive director and even doing the annual board evaluation where they evaluate themselves. Those are governance kinds of things. A board is responsible for strategy. It's not the CEO's job to make sure there's a strategic plan. It's the board's responsibility to insist that we have an up-to-date strategic plan, that we know our strategy and we're moving forward. It may only be 3 pages long. It doesn't have to be a 100-page document, but we have a strategy. We know where we're going. It's our written plan. The board should insist that that's in place and that that's written and that that's updated annually. And that's that defining the mission of the organization that you see up above. And finally, a board's responsibility for fundraising. There are a few boards, and I've been on one that didn't require their board members to do any fundraising or give, but 98% of them need you to give, and they need you to participate in fundraising in some way. And when you have held up your hand and approved the budget, you've also raised your hand and said, I'm going to help secure the funds. If you don't agree to secure the funds, then don't approve a budget that's got an amount in there that has to be the annual fund that has to be raised. The difference between expenditures and revenue. Have expenditures equal revenue, and don't raise any money if you're not willing as a board member to help raise the funds. If you approve a budget that has revenue $100,000 less than expenses, and that $100,000 is your annual fund, and your development staff are charged with raising that $100,000 for your annual fund, you as a board member are saying, I've approved that budget, and I will help you secure those funds in any way using my influence, through my giving, through my being able to tell the story of the organization. Those 3 big roles of nonprofit boards are clearly delineated in this little paperback. I encourage you to buy it and give it to your board members. They can read it in less than an hour. Another part of requiring the annual board evaluation or requiring accountability is an annual board evaluation. It ought to be completed by board members and the executive director prior to the annual board meeting or at the annual board retreat. The purpose of the annual assessment is board effectiveness and board improvement. I've listed 12 typical things there that could be rated on a scale of 1 to 5 or 1 to 10. You can Google board evaluation and find instruments real easily. So, and I'm happy to, well, most of you will have a copy of this slide. You can create your own board evaluation instrument from this slide. But our boards that are exceptional and effective evaluate themselves every year. How are we doing in the fundraising area? Or how am I doing in effectively telling our story? Or do I know the mission of the organization? Do I know my elevator speech? Can I tell you exactly what our mission and purpose is? It's very important in that accountability loop and that responsibility loop for boards to evaluate themselves and score that in a way that they identify their strengths and weaknesses. One other slide that I included here that you'll have in your printed copy are items for a board packet. like so many groups, we've moved to e-governance. Many of the boards I serve on, as well as the AFP board, downloads all the bylaws, the minutes of meetings, the agenda into either SkyDrive or Dropbox, and we can go look at that material anytime. We definitely are supposed to look at it before the monthly meeting, but we call that e-governance, where your board members have access electronically to all this information. I'm a big advocate of that, but I'm also an advocate of having a physical board packet or board binder that everyone has a binder. Everyone has one. New board members receive their binder. They hang on to it. New materials, new monthly board agendas and new minutes can be added to it. I've listed a lot of those things that I think ought to be in a board binder. You'll find that self-explanatory. Some of you don't do annual reports anymore. Many of our newsletters are electronic. Excuse me. So you might not include everything there, but your written board expectations, your bylaws, your 990 form, those are important things for a board member to be able to have at his or her fingertips. Most important to me down at the bottom is a list of current board and staff members with all their contact information. I want to put their email and their phone numbers in my smartphone. I'm going to be in a relationship with these people for 3 years if that's my term on the board. I want to know how to reach them. I want to have their phone numbers, their email, and I don't want to have to thumb through a directory or search for that. I want to have it right at my fingertips. When we visit prospective board members, we often go over a board packet like this. It communicates that we're organized, we know what we're doing, and we expect these things of our board members. Current board members, I think, should always have a board packet or a board binder. That can all be managed electronically and online, and if you can do it that way without a physical binder, do so. I want to wrap this up by going back to secret number 2. Tell me who's going with you. Your board is your climbing team. Your board is that group of individuals that help you accomplish your goals, that help you get where you're going. Here are 4 points that I would make under that. First, you must be constantly prospecting for new board members. This just doesn't ever stop, y'all. It just goes on. I'm on 5 boards of directors right now. I've been on boards for 30 years, as I mentioned, and we're just always prospecting for new board members, for great board members. That just doesn't end, just like we never stop prospecting for donors. A second point is executive directors must spend a fourth or a third of their time in board development. I know this is hard, but where I've seen it practiced, I've seen it really pay off. A very exceptional board doesn't just happen. It's built, and some great executive directors that I've worked with have built some great boards. Some of you have more control over building your board than others. Some are appointed to your board, and some have boards that you don't have as much control. I would encourage you to seek to have as much control over who serves on your board as your legal structure allows. Third, no nonprofit organization can realize its potential without an exceptional board. This goes back to the very beginning. We can build a great staff. We can build great volunteers, but you can't become the organization that potentially you would like to be without an exceptional board. And finally, you must continually build and rebuild your team. You can look at any athletic endeavor, any sports team. They're just constantly building and rebuilding. I wish we could just reach utopia and have a wonderful board and have it for 30 years, but it doesn't work that way. We continually build and rebuild that board, maybe changing its size, maybe changing its composition, diversifying it more, getting more young board members on the board, but live by that principle that you're continually building and rebuilding your team. Well, you can hear I'm almost hoarse, and there's time for a few more questions, Jessica, if there are some additional questions.
Thank you very much, Tom. And just a reminder to our attendees, if you have a question, just click on that Q&A button in the upper left-hand corner, type it in, and then click Ask to submit it. One question we have. So I'm a little confused. On our fundraising board, do we let some board members off the hook with, say, their expertise, which would then be equivalent to money?
Is yours a foundation board? Do we know if the questioner's board is a foundation board?
I believe it might be. The question was submitted by, it says a foundation, so I believe it might be.
No, I think it would be typical, if it's a foundation board, that we would expect a financial and cash contribution from foundation board members because their primary purpose is fundraising. They come on that board clearly knowing that. Again, we have to handle people who bring some special expertise and maybe even connections for in-kind contributions. We at the university, we gift receipted every in-kind contribution from small to large and treated it equally with a cash gift or a pledge. So again, that'd kind of be my take on that. I think a governing board might have a little more flexibility, but a foundation board is expecting the people who serve on its board not only to give but to be actively involved in fundraising.
Thank you very much. Next question, can you offer any thoughts on board terms and term limits?
Absolutely. I prefer these terms that have a one-year break between them. Let me give you a couple examples. One of the boards that is an exceptional board has a 4-year term. You can serve 2 consecutive 4-year terms, but then you have to rotate off for a year. I've seen some boards who have a 4-year term and you have to rotate out for a year before you can come back on for another 4-year term. I think it's much more typical to use 3-year terms in my personal experience, and typically a person can serve 2 consecutive 3-year terms, then they've got to spend a year off the board, and then they can be invited to come back on.
Thank you. Another question. If you are starting a founding board, how do you go about soliciting?
Boy, I probably have a lot of questions myself. I think if that's a bit of a challenge, but go back to that pre-recruitment. Look for people that line up with your cause. I have almost a blindness in my left eye from an accident when I was a child. I have 20/20 vision in my right eye, and I stumbled across an eye clinic in Kenya 10 years ago that I've just become passionate about because they treat treatable eye disease, and they treat 30,000 people a year for free in the country of Kenya for eye disease. No, if they would have been founding their board or starting it, they wouldn't have known me. They wouldn't have come looking for somebody they didn't know. But if they would have found me and discovered that I cared a lot about eye problems and that I'd had my share of eye problems and that I'm passionate about seeing children get their eyesight back and people treated and for glaucoma or cataracts or whatever, that's that passion for the organization. That's when we know a person lines up with us. That's one part of that, the passion. Another is, are they generous? Or they open up their purse and give? Do they have that kind of reputation? And again, what kind of person, what are the competencies of the people that we're looking for? You generally can determine that you're dealing with a man or woman of character, but ask what their competencies are. As you're developing a founding board, you may be looking for 6 people initially on your founding board, and they need to have, you need some with some competencies. Maybe the attorney to help you go ahead and set up bylaws or legal documents, maybe the CPA, maybe the certified financial planner. So look for skills and competencies as well, along with those other things, and And I think that's a good place to start if you're founding a board.
Thank you very much. Another question. We have an advisory board for a university public garden. We are considering adding a Friends of board. Some of our existing members would probably rather be helping with events and contributing time rather than being a big contributor or identifying contributors. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think go with your instincts there. I personally have not had much great experience with advisory boards. Somehow there's either the spoken or unspoken expectation that, well, you're a wise person and we just want your advice. We'll just meet once a year. We'll just have we'll bring you around every once in a while. I think boards that are more specific, foundation boards, fundraising boards, event boards, they have more of a compelling purpose. Now, I may be telling you to disband your advisory board, and I'm not necessarily saying that, but that would be my initial reaction. I'd love to talk some more about that with you.
Thank you. Another question. When thinking of retiring a board member, is it practical to use a first meeting with a less active board member as a wake-up call and give them a chance to re-engage?
That's a great idea. That often happens as you make that appointment and go see them.
Thank you. Another question. How do we get some younger people on the board?
That's a great question. I think, again, the board needs to have that conversation. It needs to be on the agenda. We're not just going to have a discussion about who would make a good board member, but who are some younger people that we can identify that need to come on the board, and then what is our plan for bringing them on? Can we bring on one a year, two a year? I think a plan for bringing them on even incrementally like that gets you further than saying, sure wish we had some younger people on this board, but then you run into resistance from the current board members, and they just really don't want a younger board member. But if you'll use this process of pre-recruitment and those three criteria and then screen them and get an application and encourage some sharp young people who also have a passion for your organization to be a part of the process. If you'll use that process, I believe we can diversify our boards, whether that's by gender, race, or whatever. I believe we can get younger people on our boards, but we kind of have to make a plan and then work the plan.
Thank you. Next question. Where in a small nonprofit budget are the funds for a board retreat?
Well, the executive director should recommend that in December or whenever you do your budget that you put a sum of money in there. I actually think board members of nonprofits should bear some of the expense themselves. If it's an overnight, they pick up their room cost. They ought to make some investment in it. But if you just started the first year with $1,500 or $2,000 in a line item for board retreats, that's what we have at our AFP chapter. We have a couple of $1,000, and at some point we just created a line item for an annual board retreat and voted to put an initial sum of money in that line item.
Thank you. And next question, what do you really like about your board?
Well, I'm going to use one of the boards that I serve on that I've described as an exceptional board. I love to meet with these people. This is a national board, and they live all over the United States. They come together face-to-face only once a year. In the spring and the fall, we do a teleconference board meeting, but I look forward to spending time with the people on this board. They're gifted and exceptional people. We do the business of the organization, but in our breaks and over our meals and that kind of time, we get better acquainted, and I think it's just the opportunity to rub shoulders with and build relationships with some like-minded people.
Thank you very much. Another question, what, if any, frustrations do you have with any current board?
You know, that's a great question for most of our participants to ask and identify is what are my current frustrations. Sometimes we're frustrated, we're a little agitated, but we need to drill down and see what it is that we really are frustrated about. Most of those things can be categorized in 2 or 3 areas. One, our board is not active, or 2, some of our board aren't, or 2, they don't participate. How can I get them to participate better? Or 3, they just refuse to do fundraising. And of course, there's an answer for all those things. They need some training to do fundraising. They need to be taught how to participate. In the best boards that I work with, we use an instrument called the action item, and it's recorded in the minutes. We come to something that needs to be done, and we don't want to push it off on a staff member, and we say, we need an annual audit, for example. Who on the board will arrange for that annual audit? Well, Rick speaks up and says, I'll arrange for the annual audit. So we put an action item in the minutes that say, Rick so-and-so, by March the 1st or whatever, will arrange for an annual audit of our books. Or another example is we've got a big golf tournament coming up in Dallas, and who's going to chair that this year? Well, Fred lives in Dallas. He knows a lot of golfers, and he said, I'll chair the golf tournament. Golf tournaments shouldn't be staff functions. They're board responsibilities. So this board member who's responsible for fundraising says, I'll put a committee together. We'll meet. We'll decide which course we're going to play, and I'll get that underway. I know 18 foursomes. That's 72 players. I'll organize the golf tournament. In the minutes, we say Fred is going to chair the annual golf tournament this year, and that assures board participation. It takes a couple of years for that to spread around to all the board members where they say, I could do that, I could do that. You're not trying to get them involved in day-to-day operations or day-to-day management, but you are trying in the general areas of governance, strategy, and fundraising to volunteer and to participate in those areas. At the very next meeting, we separate out, we put all the action items on a separate sheet, and we read the action items to keep us all accountable and see if Rick has arranged for the audit, if Fred is chairing and has had his first meeting of the golf tournament committee. It's an accountability loop, and that assures board participation. If you would simply use the action item method and use it consistently for 2 or 3 years, you'll find a way that every board member can participate. We had a retired board member on one of our boards. We didn't even know this. He had worked for a corporate entity his whole career. He didn't know how he could help. He couldn't give much money. He had some disabilities and some real health and medical costs. And we said, we need some policies written. That's what boards do in governance. We need a maternity, paternity leave policy. We need conflict of interest policy, confidentiality policy. Well, this guy was great. He loved to write those things. And so the action item said, this gentleman will draft our conflict of interest policy and bring it to the next board meeting. Most of our frustrations come around inactive or non-participative board members.
Thank you very much. Another question we have, do your staff members attend board retreats?
Yes, I think senior staff, I think every organization is different in size and scope, and you have to decide who should attend. At the university, all the VPs attended board retreats and board meetings because VPs had to make a report to the full board. But in smaller organizations where you have a development director and other kinds of development staff, I think it's very appropriate for them to be there. You may have a development committee of the board, and that development committee may be staffed by the development director. So you have to just determine what the functions and committees of the board are and what staff are assigned to those and need to be there. I'm not an advocate of keeping staff away from the board, but you do have to draw up some guidelines and some parameters for that board-staff interaction.
Thank you very much. And that is all the questions we have at this time. I'll give our attendees another minute or two to submit any final questions. In the meantime, Tom, do you have any final remarks you'd like to make?
Yeah, I just really want to encourage you to make this a priority in 2013. In my experience, many of you have great boards, I'm sure, but in my experience, board development and board governance just really need some attention, and we would build more quality organizations and stronger organizations if we devoted a little bit more time this next year to board development. Thanks so much for mostly listening to me and for all your questions and your participation.
Thank you very much, Tom. And that does appear that's all the questions we have for today, so we will go ahead and wrap up. I do want to remind everyone of our next event coming up on December 13th, Fundraising Trends, What Worked Over the Last Few Years, What We Can Expect for 2013 and Beyond. For more information on this webinar and all of the 2012-2013 webinars, you can go to afpnet.org. And at this point, I'd like to go ahead and bring up our evaluation for today. If you all would, please take a moment to fill out this brief survey. We would really appreciate it, as it helps AFP improve future webinars. We certainly do appreciate any and all feedback. The survey will loop so everyone at your location can fill it out. On behalf of AFP, I would like to thank all of you for joining us today and for your great questions. I would also like to thank Tom for sharing his expertise. This concludes today's presentation. To end this call, you can simply hang up.